Okay, so this is the, again, this is the fourth part of a four-part series. And we are recording all these, and these are all on the TNL that took the Norbu Ling website and on YouTube, basically, actually. We have a channel on there. And again, we will, this course is repeated every other month. So we're doing it now, and we'll repeat it again in May. So hopefully this is the exciting conclusion. I hope that I've been able to keep your attention. And so in this class, so in the beginning classes, the earlier classes, we started by talking about what Buddhism is, who Buddhists are, how you define yourself as a Buddhist, the history of Buddhism, the biography of Buddha, and so forth. And then gradually we've worked our way through the beginning parts of Buddhism. And what we've been doing now, for the, especially I think these last two classes in this series, is going in detail actually about the path to enlightenment. And to me, that was one of the most astonishing things that I learned about Buddhism, is that there's this very explicit and detailed path to enlightenment. And it's sort of amazing that you can actually lay out a full path to enlightenment. And so we're in the middle of these things. And in the beginning, we've sort of broken down this path to enlightenment in sort of three major stages. The first path that we started last week was on renunciation, which is the wish to leave samsara, which is sort of this world that we're in. And when you leave samsara, that's when you attain nirvana. And the reason why you want to leave samsara is because, as the Buddha said, the goal for all of us, and the goal that the Buddha focused on, was to be happy. And essentially what the Buddha said is there's no happiness in samsara. And sometimes this unhappiness, the Sanskrit word of which is dukkha, is sometimes translated as suffering. And it certainly contains suffering. But again, it's the problem you have with any translation from one language to another language, is that you can never find one single word that absolutely translates it. You actually have to give sort of a little definition. And the more general notion of this word dukkha is unsatisfactory. It means that you can never sit on your laurels and just be happy. Is that even when you have good circumstances, what the Buddha really emphasized is the nature of this world is continual change, constant change. So even if you have the most wonderful thing that you have, it's going to change. You can't hang on to it. You know, in this life, even if you have a great life, you have maybe you don't have any health problems, maybe you have lots of wealth. Even if everything goes right, in the end, you're going to have to die. And as I've said, you end up being reborn. But it's even more normally what we find is anything you have in life never remains satisfactory. If you have the most delicious meal you've ever had, you have this intense, wonderful pleasure, but then the meal's over. And fades. You buy a brand new car, and the car is brand new in the beginning, but then it gets old. And it's like that for everything. And that is the nature of the world. And so what Buddhists basically said is that as long as you remain in samsara, you're stuck. You know, you can try to improve your life, but it's like sort of like a squirrel on one of these little wheels constantly spinning round and round. You keep trying to create good karma to make your life as pleasant as possible, but you can never let up. You always have to keep focusing on not producing negative karma and continuing to produce positive karma. And there's no guarantees, because we've all, what the Buddha said is that he said he could never see any beginning to any of our lives. So we produced this large amount of karma in the past, and who knows what's sitting there. Now, there are ways of purifying that in the Mahayana tradition, but nonetheless, there's, you always feel like there's this sort of ticking time bomb of, what is this karma? We can't see our karma. We don't know what's there. And there's always this concern that maybe some karma will go on and produce some negative experiences. So the goal in the Buddhist path is to attain liberation from samsara. And that was the goal of renunciation, is really the realization that, samsara is just not going to work. You need to get out. And there is a path to get out. And that's what we talked a lot about last week. And then at the end of last week, we started talking about the Mahayana Path. And this is a set of higher realizations. And this set of higher realizations is that there's a higher goal than just liberation from samsara. And part of the motivation for this higher goal was that even at the time that Buddha was alive, many people attained liberation from samsara. And technically that's called becoming an arhat, is liberation. When you become liberated from samsara, you become an arhat. And when you become an arhat during this life, you continue until the end of your life. But then when you reach the end of your life, you are never again reborn in samsara. You're born in this really amazing, wonderful state, as Buddha described it. But actually, we don't really know what nirvana is like because it's not in samsara. It goes beyond any kind of words or description we have, but the Buddha certainly hinted that it's amazing. And perhaps the closest we can come to it in this life is through very, very deep meditations. You can reach this amazing state of absolute bliss and peacefulness. And the Buddha actually even suggested that. It's like, if you can learn these deep meditation states, it's absolutely amazing. But that's probably as close as we can come to nirvana. So we don't really know what it's like, but we do know what this life is like in samsara, and that it's unsatisfactory. And basically what the Buddha seemed to suggest is that nirvana is eternal peace and happiness. So now, but as I was saying, what we've learned is that the Buddha was at a higher level than all of these other arhats. He had sort of omniscience, ability to know anything, and he also know the details of how karma worked for everybody, which the arhats didn't know. And eventually, as Buddhism developed, starting roughly about 500. So Buddha lived around 500 BC, roughly. And this Mahayana Path started a little bit around around the birth of Christ, maybe a little bit before. So about 500 years after Buddha. And this Mahayana Path explicitly said, no, the goal should really be to become this higher state, at the same higher state that Buddha's at. And this is the Mahayana Path. And the key thing that you need to achieve this higher path is, the other thing we've talked about in Buddhism is that Buddhism is a completely causal path. Everything happens because of cause and effect. And if you don't create the causes for anything to happen, the result won't happen. So if you want to achieve this amazing state of Buddhahood, you have to create the causes to attain it. And since a Buddha is nearly, or perhaps even an infinite being, you have to create huge amounts of positive karma to take yourself from being an arhat all the way to becoming a Buddha. And so the good news is, and of course there has to be the good news because Buddha existed. And what Buddha always said, he said, if you do exactly the same thing I do, if you create the same causes and conditions, that Buddha said, I was once just like you, but I created the causes and conditions to become a Buddha. So you can, if you follow the same path that I follow, you yourself will achieve the same result I do. So then the key is, for the Mahayanists, they say, well, what do you need to achieve that amazing amount of extra merit? And the spiritual attainment you need is called bodhicitta. And so when you achieve this spiritual quality called bodhicitta, and when it's spontaneous bodhicitta, what it means is it just bubbles up from within you day and night, 24 zip. It's always there. It's a very deep realization. When you achieve this very deep realization of bodhicitta, that's what gives you this giant merit making or positive karma making machine that enables you to develop and become a full Buddha. Now, the first thing that's important that we, again, reviewing a little bit of last week, what we talked about last week is what is this definition of bodhicitta? And once we show, write down definition, in itself, the definition tells you why it's so powerful. So the goal of bodhicitta is two parts. It has two parts, and you need both parts, and both parts are conjoined together in one seamless thing. So the first part to bodhicitta is the goal of attaining full Buddhahood, not going beyond arhat to become a full Buddha. So that's the first half of it. But the second half is equally important. The reason, the motivation why you're doing it is not because you yourself want eternal bliss. It's because you want to help all other sentient beings achieve the same state of Buddhahood and remove all of their suffering. And the reason, again, as I was explaining last week, it's the second part that makes bodhicitta such a huge merit-generating machine. Because as we talked about last week, if you do, like let's say you feed one hungry person, then you generate a certain amount of positive karma. If you feed two hungry people, you generate twice as much positive karma. If you feed three and so forth. Well, and again, karma is generated mainly by the intention. So it's your intention to help people by feeding them that generates karma. So in bodhicitta, what is our intention? Our intention is basically to remove the suffering of every single sentient being. And since the number of sentient beings is nearly infinity, if you're maintaining this motivation day and night at every single moment of your life, then you are generating almost infinite amounts of positive karma, almost every moment, day and night. And it's because of this enormous power, this enormous merit-making machine of bodhicitta, that you can generate the cause that will bring you to full Buddhahood. And like I say, I mean, this bodhicitta is just not like, there's different levels of bodhicitta. For most of us, we're in sort of aspiring bodhicitta. Sometimes they call it fake bodhicitta, but it's still very powerful. So fake is maybe an unfair denigration. But this sort of fake bodhicitta or this aspiring bodhicitta it's called artificial because in our minds, we're working toward this goal as much as we can. But the difference between this aspiring and the full bodhicitta, the real bodhicitta, is that we don't have the spontaneous wish to do it day and night. And so the spontaneous wish to do it day and night is a very deep spiritual realization. And it usually requires some very deep meditative states to attain it. And so we're going to talk more about what this process is, and obviously in the course of the last couple hours, I can't give you all the details, but I'm going to try to give you enough details so that you get a sense of how this path works. So that's a little background from last week. So the final stages of the Mahayana Path is first you generate bodhicitta. That turns you into a bodhisattva, a person who's bound for Buddhahood. And then the main practice that you practice once you achieve this are called the 6 perfections. And I will talk about that. And then I will talk about the deep meditations, the final stages you need to take you all the way to the final path, even though they're, huge paths. But before you can even get started, again, you have to first develop this bodhicitta. And this bodhicitta is not going to fall out of the sky and hit you on the head. It's like everything in Buddhism, you have to work at it. You have to create the causes to generate this bodhicitta. So the first thing you do, the starting point, is the things like I've been talking about. You discover what an amazing thing bodhicitta is and how powerful it is. And there's many books in the Buddhist tradition, which, especially Shantadeva's book, the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. These books are, they sing the praises of bodhicitta and the bodhisattva way of life, because first you need that desire to want to develop this spiritual quality. So that's the first stage. And the way you do that, and this is actually almost like a paradigm for everything in Buddhism. In Buddhism, when you want to develop a spiritual quality, the first thing you do is you investigate that quality and you see what all of the benefits of that quality are. And through investigating in detail and understanding the benefits and what that quality brings to your life, that's what gives you the motivation to develop the spiritual quality. So for any spiritual realization, there's always this beginning step, first understanding what it is and why it's so beneficial. And then once you're sort of hyped up and really want to go for it, then you need the method to accomplish it. And that's always the second stage. And the beautiful thing about the Buddhist path is it always has the details, steps that you take step by step. And for anything in the Buddhist path, it always gives you a graduated path. You take baby steps in the beginning, and then that leads to more advanced steps. And you gradually work your way up until you achieve the final spiritual realization. So in a way, going through this bodhicitta thing is a nice little paradigm. Besides talking about bodhicitta, I think you can generalize it to sort of any quality that you attain in Buddhism. Okay, so I've given you the sales pitch for why bodhicitta is so wonderful. And I mean, Lama Yeshe, who was one of the guys that started our series of centers, he's dead now, but he used to talk about some text of Tsongkhapa where Tsongkhapa says, once you start practicing bodhicitta, it's like you get this rain of good things happening to you. It just falls down because you're generating so much positive merit, so much positive karma. But anyway, that's the sales pitch. So now the next stage is what I'm turning to now, is what are these steps? How do you actually develop this spiritual attainment? And there's actually, in our tradition, they actually give you two different ways. The first way I'm going to give you, I think, is the easiest way. So it's the way that you take sort of the smallest baby steps and you work your way up. And as I go through this method, I think you can see the logic of it. It's a very logical method. I mean, that's the other thing I love about Buddhism, is it's all so logical and laid out so wonderfully. But anyway, this first step is called the sevenfold cause and effect method. And then I'm going to give you a second way, which I think it was described a lot in Shantadeva's books, which is called equalizing and exchanging self with others. And that's a more advanced technique. But for some people, that technique works very well. And what people suggest is that perhaps in previous lives, some of you have worked at developing bodhicitta. And if you've worked at developing bodhicitta and you've developed some positive karma with bodhicitta, sometimes people like that can go faster. And so the second way is a way of sort of going faster and sort of getting to bodhicitta on sort of a quicker, more direct path. But again, you're skipping over a lot of the baby steps, so it's more advanced. But again, maybe if you've had the karma from previous lives of having worked with bodhicitta before, maybe you can take the quick path. So in a sense, that's why you have two paths. And again, this is again sort of paradigmatic of Buddhism. In Buddhism, we always have many different ways of reaching any goal because everybody's different. Everybody has a different karmic background. People like and dislike different things. So it's actually very important to have lots of different techniques for achieving anything because we're all so different. And what resonates with one person, maybe another person hates, and vice versa, and so forth. So anyway, for these two things for bodhicitta, I'm going to go through them now. So let me just stop here and ask if there's any questions. So, okay. Okay, so here we go. So this is a sevenfold cause and effect. So the sevenfold cause and effect has to, I mean, the thing that you're really after is getting this goal of wishing, having great compassion for the suffering of all other sentient beings. Again, sentient being in Buddhism is a being with a mind. And the reason we don't say humans is because in Buddhism, there's these other realms like animals and other realms where people have minds. But anyway, you know, you can just think about it as human beings for the purposes of this, if you haven't had these other teachings. But anyway, so what we have to do is you have to feel such a strong compassion for everyone without exception, because that's what's going to drive you to make this huge effort to attain bodhicitta. And again, I will come back to this, what are the steps that bring you to wanting to achieve Buddhahood. So the first step you're going to have is essentially you go through two stages. First of all, you have to develop love, some kind of affectionate love for a person, because the only people that we have a strong compassion for are people that we feel deeply about. You know, it's like, especially people in our family, you know, our siblings or children or whatever, you know, it's those sort of people that drive compassion for us. So we have to, first of all, develop those sort of feelings about all other sentient beings before we can develop compassion. So that's the first intermediate goal. The next intermediate goal is developing this sort of compassion. And then finally, you realize that if you're really going to help people, you have to become a Buddha. And that brings you to the final result. So that's sort of the bigger framework of the process we're going through. So what are the baby steps? Well, first of all, if you're going to develop some kind of love or affection for people, the first thing is, the first baby set is just actually equalizing with others. Because right now, there's some people we like, some people we don't like, we hate people, we love people. So the first thing is just sort of bringing everyone down to a level playing field. So this is called developing equanimity, which means feeling exactly the same about all people. And so you do a series of meditations and thought and different ways of thinking about them. You know, and for example, you think that, well, everybody's really the same. We all want to be happy. None of us wants to suffer. So at least at that level, we're all exactly the same. And as you work through those sort of points of view and so forth, eventually in meditation, you can develop this feeling that, yes, we're all the same. You know, we may be different. Some of us have different attainments. Some of us, you know, are more moral, less moral, whatever. But deep in our heart, there's really nothing. There's no reason why I should be more happy than you, for example. There's absolutely no logical reason. There's no more logical reason why you should be more happy than me. And so as you work through all of these things, you develop this equanimity. So then once you've got this equanimity, then the question of it is how do you go from that equanimity to actually developing love for people? And the way that they do this traditionally is sort of an outrageous trick. It's based in reality, but it really will feel like an outrageous trick. But if you can do it, it works. And that's what matters, is whether it works or not. And so this outrageous trick is to realize that every other sentient being has at one time been our mother. And the logic behind this is interesting. So in this logic, all of us have had an infinite number of previous lifetimes. So if you've had an infinite number of previous lifetimes, then at some point, every other one of us must, you know, every life we've had a mother. So you ask yourself, where are all these mothers? Well, all of these mothers must be populating all the other sentient beings. And so if you go through this logic, you realize that everybody's been our mother at one point. And some people have bad current mothers. They get turned off by this argument. So what you have to do is think, we probably had not only everybody has been our mother, but they've been our mother many times. And one of those previous times, they must have been a good mother. Let's see. So we have one question. Yeah, TH, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, thanks, Bob. In previous sessions, you mentioned you don't have to believe in karma, past future lives. So with this one, how would you approach developing bodhicitta and having compassion and love for everybody?
Okay, that's a very good question. Yeah, because, again, Buddhism is not about belief, it's about practice. What people would say, I think, and this is again something that runs all throughout Buddhism. All throughout Buddhism, there's an active use of imagination. And imagination can be our best friend. And we're at the end of this class, we're going to go from bodhicitta to the teachings on emptiness. But after that, we're going to talk about the Tantric or Vajrayana path. And in the Vajrayana path, it really is based almost all on imagination. So following that example, although again, what in Buddhism they would say, yes, you can think of it as imagination, but if you have a deeper spiritual realization, you will realize that it ultimately has a truthful basis. So it's more than imagination. But nonetheless, imagination works perfectly well to accomplish the goal. And in this case, the goal is to develop bodhicitta. And if your goal is to develop bodhicitta, it's perfectly fine just to, even if you don't believe in previous life, just imagine think as if every other person at one time had been our mother. Just make up this fictional world that everybody at one time has been our mother. Because the goal is that this thought of everybody being our mother is actually just a crutch. It's just a method. It's a technique. It's a trick for tricking us into being able to develop love and compassion for all other beings. So if you don't believe in previous lives, I would say just throw caution to the winds and go along for the ride, and just try to develop in your imagination. Just try to imagine this as a possibility. Is that helpful at all? Okay.
Yeah, I personally have confidence in karma and past lives, future lives, so it's easier for me, but I just remember your point from last session. So
yes.
Maybe would it also be helpful to think, okay, if that's hard for you to imagine, think, like the Dalai Lama and Venerable Rubina says, like even her glass of coconut milk or coconut water, so many people were involved in the production of that for her to have that glass of coconut water that she enjoys. So in a way, everybody has contributed to our happiness. We may not see all the ties, but the fact that we have a place to live in, that we have food, all these are the result of everybody's effort. Even if they hate you, they're doing their job and they're contributing to the economy and production. And so they're all, in a sense, our mother. They're taking care of us.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And in fact, that is one of the traditional meditations or ways of thinking that's involved with all of this. And that is an absolutely helpful way of thinking, because, and it's absolutely true. I mean, all of us are dependent on this whole network of our whole society for our happiness. And, and we would fall to pieces if we didn't have that. And I mean, another way of also thinking about it also is, again, this notion that everybody is just like us. They want to be happy. We want to be loved. So why shouldn't other people want to be loved? And if we want other people to love us, why shouldn't we love other people? So there's many different ways of thinking about this that is helpful. But the way you mentioned is one of the traditional ways of thinking about it. And it is a very helpful way of thinking about it. And again, I'm only giving you the bare bones, but there are many detailed meditations that go along with each of these steps. And the one that you mentioned is one of these steps that one tries to do, because this notion of developing bodhicitta and love and compassion for everybody is not necessarily easy, because most of us, there's some people we just naturally dislike. But in the end, what we have to do for real bodhicitta, it has to be everyone that you care about. You can't say, I just want my friends to become enlightened and I don't care about these other people. For real bodhicitta to work, it has to be what they call universal compassion, or great compassion, great love, universal for everyone. So that's the goal. But again, it's something that you have to work up on. And in fact, in the baby steps, inside some of these steps, you actually start at a smaller level. For example, traditionally, even when you're developed this notion of equanimity or love, you usually start with people that you already love. And then you try to expand that group to people that maybe you just feel neutral about. And then eventually the goal is to expand it to even people you dislike. So it's there's a whole long process involved with this. And again, it is important to take these baby steps. I mean, you can't jump from where we are now to loving even people that you hate or strongly dislike. You have to build up all the intermediate steps. But as you slowly build these up, as you expand these groups and expand the number of people that you feel these things for, it gets easier and easier. So that's the good thing. And again, it's like all of your resistances, there are various sort of antidotes, ways that you attack the resistances you feel. It's like you can look at, well, why do I hate somebody? And for example, one thought that helps tear down that resistance is you realize, again, how changeable hatred is. And so people do meditations where they think about, sometimes there are people you absolutely hate. And then sometimes you accidentally get to know them better. And then later in life, you actually become good friends with them and they might become your best friend. And the same way, it's very common for people to have this close circle of friends. And then one of their best friends may say something horrible or set them off. And then after that, the person hates them for the rest of their life. So once you start to see how changeable friends and enemies are, and that they're not fixed things, that people aren't fixed as your enemies or fixed as your friends, it develops this notion, well, it's possible to change this. One isn't locked into that. And then once you start thinking about that, it makes it easier to go to this thing of developing love for everybody. So it is a tricky thing. So I don't want to overestimate, if this is just this really simple thing to do. So I'm giving you this very big path, but all these little steps that go along the way are equally important. And that's why we have, you can take a course in bodhicitta that might last many months because it goes through all of these details. And in many ways, to make it a practical and effective thing, you sort of need all of these details. So anyway, thank you for that question, because I think that is a very good question. Are there any other questions? Okay, so I will plunge. Okay, so now we even if you have to feign it, imagine that every other person that you meet at one time has been our mother. And then the next stage after that is you realize that if you have had a good mother, you need to repay her kindness, and that's just normal, actually, human emotions. Anybody that has had a good mother in his life feels gratitude for your mother, and you appreciate how wonderful it is to have a good mother. And, for all of us that have had good mothers, which I certainly had a very good mother, you want to do whatever you can to help them. You have this natural wish to repay all the wonderful ways that they've taken care of you. And so that's the next step, is you remember their kindness, and that's also developed with this thing about the kindness of other people too, because it's not only your mother, but many other people have. Sometimes people have had wonderful teachers or other relatives who have helped them in tough times, or even people at work that have helped them through hard problems. So you remember the kindness of all these other people. And then you develop these, yes. So actually the first stage is developing equanimity. The second stage is remembering that every sentient being at one time has been our mother. in some past life. The third one is remembering the kindness of the mother. And then the fourth is developing the wish to repay the kindness. And then that brings you to the fifth stage, is that once you reach that stage, you naturally develop affectionate love. You know, I think anyone that has had a wonderful mother who's done amazing things for you, you naturally feel love, you know, a very strong affectionate love for that kind of mother. And so now, but because we've generalized this to all other sentient beings who have been our mother, then we're developing this ability to feel strong affectionate love for all other sentient beings. You know, and part of the logic for this is, again, a little tricky, because you could say, well, you know, maybe this one particular sentient being has been my mother 3 billion lifetimes before. Why should I feel affectionate love for her now? And the thought or meditation that you work on for that example is you take your current mother. When your current mother dies, you still feel affectionate love for your mother. It doesn't end with her death. I mean, for me, this is actually, my mother just died last June. You know, she was 3 weeks short of being 100. So she held on for a really long time. But, you know, in my case, I don't feel any less love for her now that she's dead than when she was alive. You know, and I think that's the same for all of us. You know, just because a person dies doesn't mean that we stop loving them. And so in a sense, once you take that logic to its logical conclusion, you know, it's like, you know, if our mother 5 lifetimes ago had been a wonderful mother, again, we don't stop feeling affection or love for her just because it's 5 lifetimes ago. What difference does it matter if our, you know, in the same way, if our mother died, like for me, you know, 6 months ago, when my mother has been dead 5 years, I will still feel the same love for her. You know, if you know, in the same way, you know, people, you know, it doesn't matter how many years. So it's the same logic that even no matter how long ago this other sentient being was your mother, we should still feel the same continuing love that we felt when she was alive, because she did wonderful things for us in that lifetime. So that's the way it works. So we develop this sort of universal affectionate love for all sentient beings. So that's the first stage. That's this really big attainment. And again, like I say, I mean, you know, in the beginning, it won't be universal, but we work up to being universal. That's the goal. And again, you know, as you work on these sort of things, it gets easier and easier to sort of spread your circle of affection, if you like. So now that you've developed universal affectionate love, from that, we have to get to universal or great compassion. And how do we get there? Well, the reason why we've developed love first is because what compassion is, the way it's defined in Buddhism, is basically the wish to free someone from their suffering. So compassion is the wish to free someone from their sufferings. And since we are all in samsara, all of these sentient beings around us are suffering. They're all stuck in samsara. If we have this huge, deep love for them, we've got to want to reduce their suffering, which means we've got to want to help them escape from samsara. And so that sort of thinking is what leads you to this next stage of great compassion, of wishing, you know, to free them from samsara. And again, if your love is deep enough, this compassion goes deeper. The deeper your love, the deeper your compassion. You know, it's the sort of thing that if you have a small, you know, if you have a small child and that child is drowning in the ocean in front of you, you know, any of us that are parents would, you know, do anything we could to save that child. You know, there's many cases where mothers, people who can't even swim, still try to save their child because they have such love and compassion for their child that they will do anything to save them. And that's the sort of love and compassion that we have to develop for all sentient beings. We have to feel so intense that it's so terrible that these beings are stuck in samsara that we will do anything to help them. And that's the kind of motive, that's the kind of level that one has to get to. And in fact, that level has to go so deeply that you reach finally the, how am I doing on the counting? I should have numbered these 2, 4, 6. So then this is what causes you to develop the final stage. And the final stage of bodhicitta is not only having great compassion, but your compassion is so deep and so powerful that you feel compelled to do something about it. And that's, again, this case of, if your child is drowning in the lake or ocean in front of you, I mean, I think for any of us that are parents, there would nothing stop us. We would immediately have that intention. I've got to do something. I've got to save my kid. There would be no thought about it. We would just do that. And that's this sort of great or superior intention is sometimes what they call it. That's what you have to develop. You have to develop this motivation that where the compassion is so strong, where you say, I can't stand it. I've got to help all other sentient beings free themselves from samsara. So that's sort of the final level. And once you reach that level, that's when you develop this bodhicitta. And why do you develop this? So we've got to this feeling that you have to do something about it. Well, then you have to ask yourself, well, what can I do about it? Well, as an ordinary human being, you realize, so now we have this intention of helping not only, our kids, our spouse, our family, our friends, our coworkers. We have this desire to help every single sentient being. And you say, well, how can I do that? It's like, I only know a small number of people. So at most, I can only be able to help them. And that's when you start to look at these examples and you look around yourself and you see that people who are great spiritual beings can sometimes have enormous influence. It's like, in churches, people who are great preachers can inspire many people. We have many Buddhist, amazing monks in Buddhism who inspire great numbers of people. I mean, I think in the Buddhist tradition, the example we naturally go to is the Dalai Lama. Think about how many people the Dalai Lama connects to. And through all of his books and teachings and example, how many people he has reached and helped. And you think to yourself, yeah, if I could reach that sort of level, imagine or think of a Mother Teresa or somebody like that. You think, if I could become this great spiritual being, it's amazing how many people I could help, especially if our goal is to help people liberate themselves from samsara. The way that they have to liberate themselves from samsara is by following a spiritual path. So I have to be able to help them develop a spiritual path. And you do that from 2 ways, through example and through teachings. Okay, let's see. TH has another question. She asks if some of our celebrities can be a great spiritual being. That's actually possible. It's said in Buddhism that, we ourselves don't have much ability to know who great spiritual beings are. It may be that the janitor of your old high school was a great spiritual being. We can't see in that. And in fact, it's often taught in Buddhism that the negativities of our mind actually often preclude us from recognizing people of great spiritual quality. So yes, I mean, celebrities could be great spiritual beings. Even one of your friends or people could be a great spiritual being. We just don't have that kind of insight. And so I think there's, effectively, there's nothing we can do about it. But nonetheless, I think probably the best sense we have of spiritual people is there's just some people that you can just sort of sense that there's just something special about him. And certainly someone like the Dalai Lama, you just see, it's like he just walks down a hotel lobby and people who meet him are just, people talk to him for just a few seconds. I mean, it's just the way they react to him is just amazing. So anyway, so the thought becomes then is that we're sort of said, well, we've got to do something to help these people. So then you develop this thought, I have to become a great spiritual being because that's the best way that I can do this. And then if you push that thought to its limit, basically the deepest spiritual being there is a Buddha. And the Buddha is a being of almost infinite power that can help us. And so then that's how you go to this final stage. I have to become a Buddha. So again, but at this stage, you've been driven to that, and you've been driven to that by this notion of great compassion. And so at that point, you develop this great or spontaneous bodhicitta, and then you start working actively on this path in a twofold way to benefit everyone you meet as much as possible, and also to develop your own abilities to become to develop your own Buddhahood, not so that you can be happy or have a blissful nirvana, but so that you can relieve the suffering of all of these other sentient beings who are suffering in samsara. Okay, so that's the sevenfold cause and a path. And so I hope you see that as we've gone down through the steps of this path, how the logic is all focused on actually helping you develop this spiritual quality. So let me ask if there's any questions here.
Bob, I have a question.
Yes, Kathleen.
Do these have to be perfected in order?
No.
Do you shift through?
Many, in most of Buddhists, in almost this entire Buddhist path. So I've been laying out this path from the very beginning stages to very high attainments. In almost everything you do in Buddhism, you work many levels simultaneously. And so it's not really, so I lay it out logically step by step because you see the logic of how one thing helps the other. But most people cycle through many of these, what many people do, there are various meditation retreats and so forth. And so in some of these meditation retreats, people will work on developing bodhicitta, and they might actually do meditations at each of these 7 stages. Even though they haven't achieved the earlier ones, they will still do meditations on the higher ones. Because all of these things work together. It's like they're all pushing in the same direction. So for most people, they will do meditations in all different 7 levels. So I've laid them out in a logical way, but in reality, people tend to actually work in many different levels. And it's the same way for any of the other spiritual realizations. There are more advanced techniques, there are simpler techniques, there's more advanced ways of thinking about it, simpler ways of thinking about it. It's very common for people to work in many different levels. And the same thing will happen when I get to the Tantric or Vajrayana. It'll be the same thing. There's 2 different stages of Tantric practice. And in principle, one stage should come first and the other stage comes second. But in practice, people work in both simultaneously. So yeah, no, you don't have to, you don't have to fully achieve one before you achieve the other. You just sort of, you sort of keep going on parallel levels. And you don't have to really worry about where you are. As long as you're working at any of this stuff, you will gradually advance further and further along. And if you work at a more advanced level, it will actually help you achieve the earlier things. And so I would say it's even good to work on multiple levels simultaneously because it sort of gives you a broader path, a broader outlook. And each one sort of reinforces the other. So. Yeah, so that's a very good question. Thank you for asking that, because I should have told you that. Like, I always forget all these things that I should say. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay. Okay. So now that's the first stage. So now we're going to go into the other way of looking at achieving bodhicitta. And this other way of developing bodhicitta is actually very helpful, because the sort of points of view that you have about doing this actually, again, reinforces the other way. So it's actually, so this equalizing and exchanging self with other. So even if your main path is the sevenfold cause and effect, it's helpful to go off and do meditations on equalizing and exchanging self with others, because it gives you different ways of thinking about bodhicitta that makes the sevenfold cause and effect path faster and more powerful. It reinforces it. So again, it's the same thing that I think Kathleen was talking about, sort of doing multiple things. Because these things are hard to do. And so all of the different techniques, to have a lot of, have a huge bag of tricks to help you is very, very helpful. And so trying out different things. And you may find also that at different times, you may start off working on sevenfold cause and effect. And at some point, you may actually like equalizing and exchanging self with others, and you can switch over to the other path, and that's perfectly fine. Or sometimes you can follow both paths simultaneously. Any way you want to, whatever's helpful is what matters. And so whatever is helpful, go for it. So this equalizing and exchanging self with others is just a beautiful way of thinking. So it starts off sort of in the beginning stage. In the beginning, I talked about developing equanimity. So the first stage of equalizing and exchanging self with others is the equalizing self phase. And so that's basically very much the same as this equanimity phase, the sevenfold cause and effect. And so there, you strongly work on this feeling of how we're all the same. And it's the same logic that I gave you before, that all of us wish to be happy. All of us wish to avoid to be suffering. And there's no reason why I'm better than you, so my happiness should matter more than you. There's no reason why you should suffer in order to make me happy. And there's no reason I should suffer to make you happy. And so for that reason, we're all at the same level. So that's the equalizing stage. And so that's something that one does a lot of meditations, and one thinks about this in many different ways until you really get it. We're, at a very deep level, we are all the same. And none of us can take advantage of anybody else. We're all the same. And then once you really get it, that we're all the same, then you think about a notion which is called self-cherishing and cherishing others. And this is a very powerful set of way of thinking. And this terminology is sort of universally used in Buddhism, cherishing, this notion of cherishing, self-cherishing, cherishing others. So the way you think about it is you think, for most of us, we're really focused on self-cherishing. It's just naturally the way we are. The way we are is we're naturally egotistical. We put ourselves first. So any time we're in a line to get something good, we want to sort of cut in line closer up. We want to jump ahead of the line. We want everything good for ourselves, and we want to be first in everything. We want the most money, we want the most power, we want the most good things in life. We don't want any kind of suffering whatsoever, and so forth. And this is, I think this is sort of deeply embedded in all of this. So there is this sort of natural egotistical way of viewing life. And that's called self-cherishing, cherishing yourself, loving yourself, meaning putting yourself at a higher level than everybody else. So when you start thinking about this self-cherishing and you compare it with just the earlier way I was talking about thinking, well, everybody's all equal. We're all the same. The two ways of thinking are incompatible. And you realize that there's no basis for self-cherishing. So that's the first thought. Another thought, as a Buddhist, and as you learn about karma, is you realize that it's really this self-cherishing that causes you to do all of the negative actions that cause all of your negative karma, which cause all of your suffering. So you realize that the self-cherishing is not a good thing at all. And in fact, it's only going to lead you to suffering. It won't lead you to anything good whatsoever. So you develop this notion that you got to get rid of the self-cherishing. It's really important to dampen down your self-cherishing. The other thing that you start thinking about is, all of us cherish others. Almost all of us, aside from a few psychopaths, perhaps, all of us have some relative, mother, parent, spouse, significant other, friend, whatever. We all have people that we love and we cherish. And when you look at your experiences with that, you realize how wonderful that is. When you do an act of giving to somebody, it makes you feel wonderful. In one of the earlier classes, I talked about, if you want to practice this, just go down the road. As you're driving down the road, think about the person in the car in front of you and just make an artificial wish. Say, I wish that you were happy. Or you can do this in a grocery line. You can look at the person in front of it. You just wish for that person to be happy. And you try to really make that as genuine as possible. Just play with that. And what you will discover is it actually gives you a warm, happy feeling inside. It makes you feel good. Just that wish for other people to be happy is a wonderful thing, and oftentimes, people that get into this mode of being generous and giving things, it can almost become like a drug because it leads to sort of these internal feelings of happiness. It can actually almost, people can't stop being generous. So this notion of being generous or cherishing others, actually, if you pay attention to your life and actually just look at it, it makes you happy. When a parent feels love for their child, that feeling of love brings you sort of this inner glow, this happiness. It's just a very natural thing. So if you sort of start thinking along these lines, that leads to the thought of, well, actually, if I could cherish others all the time, it would actually make my life good. I would really like myself a lot. I would feel good about my life. And so that's the second stage. So the second stage is just thinking about that, contemplating the disadvantages of self-cherishing and the advantages of cherishing others. And especially if you can relate it, like I say, to your own direct experiences, if you can directly experience these advantages and disadvantages and actually see them working in your life, it can become very powerful. And of course, you also do this in meditation. You do meditations on this, which are also, is usually the main path that you work on this. And then once you go to there, then eventually you discover this sort of amazing thought. And it's a thought that's called exchanging self with others. So you think about, well, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean that you can perform some miracle in action. Sometimes we talk about, well, that must be similar to, putting yourself in the shoes of somebody else or something like that. But that's not the way that's not what we're talking about here. So this exchanging self with others is actually far deeper than that. What this exchanging self with others means is it means putting other people first. So the notion of exchange is I said, we're normally egotists. So we normally have this notion of self-cherishing. And this notion of self-cherishing means putting ourselves first. So we put ourselves first is the normal way we react. So now when we exchange self with others, we flip it around and we put others first. So if you're in a long line, you go to the end of the line so that everybody else can go before you. If you're in traffic and people are cutting in front of you, hoping to get ahead of you, you're happy that they're able to get ahead. You say, oh, I'm so happy that you can, get there faster. So we start thinking in a completely opposite way to our normal way of thinking. So instead of always thinking about making ourselves happy first, we focus on the happiness of others. And we really have this strong desire to make others happy. And then once you start developing this notion of wanting to make everybody else happy, you have to ask yourself, well, how am I going to do that? And again, that leads you to this notion that you have to become a Buddha. And so that leads you to the development of bodhicitta in the same way. And again, if you want to make everybody else happy, you start noticing that they're suffering, they're stuck in samsara, and you go down this other full path and it'll lead you to bodhicitta. So it's an alternative way of looking, but it really, in some sense, it's the same way of looking, but it's just a different specific way of looking at the world. And again, this is sort of paradigmatic of most ways of Buddhism. The way we achieve higher spiritual realizations is really, in a certain sense, by looking at the world in a different way than we normally do. And that's why I always say that Buddhism is actually revolutionary, because if you really, really get Buddhism at a very deep level, it's like you're this revolutionary. You're looking at the world in a completely opposite way than is normal for our society. This focus on others rather than ourselves and so forth. So it's actually pretty amazing. So anyway, those are the two ways of achieving bodhicitta in practice. And again, like I said, many, many more details, and helpful sub-techniques and sub-techniques and so forth. But anyway, that's sort of the main path. And again, you can see, I think, so what I'm hoping here is that you can see the logic of it, and you see that it is possible to develop bodhicitta, that there is a real path to do this, and it's not just something imaginary, that it is possible that if you worked on these meditations and developing these ways of thinking, you actually could achieve bodhicitta. So that's sort of my goal. So let me stop here and ask if there's any questions. Okay, so it's 8:06. So I suggest that we take, I think I've got a lot to cover. So I suggest 5 minutes seems too short. Let's take an 8-minute break. I will set a timer for 8 minutes and then call you back. And then we're going to go through the two final things, the wisdom of Buddhism called emptiness and the Vajrayana path. Those will be the two final things that we'll go through, as well as the final steps that you take to full Buddhahood. What do you need to do? Not that it's that easy to do. So I'm going to turn off my mic and I will set a timer for 8 minutes and see you then. Okay, so now I've got the recording back on. Yeah, I'm always a little bit torn in these classes because the Buddhist path is so vast and I'm struggling to get through it all. But I feel like you have to give enough details so you actually see how it works. So I'm sort of always fighting these two tendencies. So I was actually wrong. There are just a couple more things to talk about in the Mahayana Path, which I think are important. But because I want to cover everything, I'm going to try to go through them very quickly. First of all, there is this thing called the 6 perfections, which is the main thing that you practice as a bodhisattva. And these are things that, if you really think about, are sort of the logical things you should be doing if you have this motivation to help all sentient beings, and also at the same time achieve your own deep spiritual qualities so you can help people. And so these 6 perfections are the perfection of generosity, the perfection of morality, the perfection of patience, the perfection of joyous effort, the perfection of concentration, and the perfection of wisdom. And the reason they are called perfections is that, you could do any of these 6 things just by themselves, like generosity. So generosity is mainly what you think of, it's mainly giving, although there's many types of giving, even giving a teaching is a form of giving. But anyway, so each of these things you could think of as a good thing to do. But what makes them a perfection is being done with bodhicitta motivation. So for each of these 6 things, each of the 6 things are done with a bodhicitta motivation. So you're not doing it just to be generous, but you're doing it for this, because of this bodhicitta motivation. And so generosity is obviously, if you're a bodhisattva and you want to help people, you're going to be generous. Morality, again, as I talked about in the earlier classes, really means non-harming. So practicing morality means being beneficial to people and not harming them. And again, if you're a bodhisattva and you have this compassion and love for everybody, of course, you're never going to, you couldn't even think of harming anybody, any sentient being. And of course, you would want to benefit anybody any way you could. The third one, patience, is twofold, actually. One is not reacting in anger or retaliating. So when people do harmful things to you, you don't lash back at them out of anger. And again, if you're this bodhisattva, you have this deep love and compassion for people, how could you ever wish to harm people back? All you want to do is help people, even if they're harming you. So again, patience is an important quality. The other one, I guess it's the fourth one, is joyous effort. Joyous effort means delighting in virtue, delighting in practicing Buddhism and so forth. And as I said before, I sort of pointed out, so essentially it means that when you're on your spiritual path, you do it with joy. And in fact, one of the things that always attracted me to Buddhists was they seemed to be so happy. And that's what you're talking. You're happy when you're practicing to be a Buddhist. Your life is happy, it's good. And this joyous effort helps you generate the effort you need to achieve these higher spiritual qualities, because they do take work and you have to actually work at these things. But if it makes you happy, if you feel happy when you're doing it, it's like it becomes almost easy to achieve these qualities. So that's one of the practices so you actually do a practice, you work on developing this joyous effort. The fifth one is concentration or meditation. And you'll see why that comes in play, because actually deep meditations accelerate your whole spiritual path. In fact, when Buddha was alive, that is the thing that he talked to the monks around him more than anything, was the need for meditation. And then the final one is wisdom. So to achieve deep spiritual qualities, you need wisdom. And the deepest wisdom of all is this wisdom of emptiness, which I'm going to talk about next. So those are the things. So those are the actual path that a bodhisattva practices in practice. So he's developing each of these 6 different things, again, with a bodhicitta motivation. Now, there's another separate practice called, sometimes it's given 2 different names, Tibetan names, Lojong or Tonglen. And these are not separate from the Mahayana path. These are sort of like bodhicitta on steroids, so to speak. It's like they're really, really powerful Mahayana techniques. These are the techniques for me in my own personal life, are my sort of crisis techniques. Whenever I'm in crisis, these are the techniques that I really focus on. And sometimes the English translation, so there's 2 different ways that they talk about this. One, they talk about this as training the mind, is the practices. The other one they talk about is taking and giving, because taking and giving is probably the deepest, most profound aspect. There's a whole set of things associated with this, but taking and giving is the one practice that is the most powerful practice I know, actually, almost in all of Buddhism. And so this is sort of, I don't know, just it's a very intense way to practice the Mahayana path. So so the only part I'm going to talk about is the taking and giving. And this taking and giving, I talked about the sort of using your imagination. And this taking and giving is a way of using your imagination in a very powerful way. And what the taking is that you imagine taking on the suffering of other sentient beings upon yourself so that you can remove their suffering and put it upon yourself instead of them. And this is done with imagination. And it's often done with an in-breath too. This is often done and associated with a sort of breathing technique. So you breathe in, and you do also a visualization. You think about the other problems of others as this black smoke pouring into you through the crown of your head, deep into your heart, and destroying the self-cherishing at the center of your heart. So that's the visualization. The opposite visualization with the out-breath is giving. And then you imagine giving them all of your happiness. In fact, you think of yourself as having achieved nirvana and infinite happiness, and giving all of these other beings your happiness in exchange. So you're taking on all their suffering and you're giving them all your happiness. Now, in real life, this isn't going to happen to you. So you don't have to worry or get worried about it. But it is such a powerful way of thinking. It's just stunning how powerful it is. And like I say, you know, whenever I'm in crisis mode, this is my go-to practice. You know, and you often do this in a very special way. So it's usually not done in general. It's often done more special. And I will give an example. In 2007, I developed sort of a random medical condition, gallstone pancreatitis. A little stone fell out of my gallbladder, blocked this important passageway in my digestive system. And I went from one moment of perfect health to the next moment of intense suffering. I went into the hospital for 2 weeks. And this is a condition that can kill you off. I nearly went into intensive care. It nearly did kill me off. And it's a very painful condition. I was taking drugs that were 80 times more powerful than morphine. And they still felt like still felt painful. So anyway, so this was, and then you know, there's not much you can do about it. It's one of these things where you sort of have to wait out. And the way the medical solution is they shut down, you don't eat or drink anything at all. They give you IVs, but you don't eat or drink anything down because you have to shut down your digestive system until your system calms down and they can do a simple operation and then fix you. But anyway, so I was stuck in this condition. And when I was stuck in this condition, I did 2 spiritual practices. One was patient acceptance, which is the way you deal with any negative karma. If you are in a terrible situation where there's absolutely nothing you can do about it, you're absolutely stuck with it, you know, and if you can do anything about something, Buddhism always say, you know, save yourself. If you've got a headache, take aspirin. You know, if you're sick, go to the doctor, do what you can do. But there are times, like in this condition, it was just this random thing that happened to me. There was absolutely nothing I can do with it. I just had to wait it out, let the doctors do their thing and hope I survived. And so when I was in this condition, I practiced patient acceptance, which means I just accepted this was some negative karma that was ripening. You know, when I look back on it, I think it was actually probably very beneficial. It was probably burning up some terrible karma that ripened this way. And it was good because maybe if it ripened some other way, it would have been far worse. So anyway, so I just accepted it and tried to keep a happy mind and just, you know, this is what happened and it's okay. So that's the first attitude that I worked on. The second attitude that I worked on was this Lojong or Tonglen. So I tried to imagine all the other people who had gallstone pancreatitis and how much they must be suffering. And maybe their condition was even worse than for me. And I imagined taking on all of their suffering upon myself so I could relieve them of their suffering in my imagination and trying to give them all of my happiness. And in fact, at the time, my pain was so intense, I actually couldn't think of any happiness to give them. I actually only did half of it. I only did the taking on their suffering. But that was extremely beneficial. And the reason what makes it so powerful is it gets you outside your egotism. because the worst pain of all for any of us is psychological pain, mental pain. And usually what happens when we're feeling pain or suffering, we're thinking, oh, woe is me, how terrible it is. All we do is think over and over again how painful it is, how bad it is, how bad we feel. And it's all egotistical. It's all focused on ourselves. So what happens when you practice this Tonglen? When you practice this Tonglen, it takes you outside of that egotism, and you're focusing on other people that are suffering. And you're thinking how other people's suffering may be even worse than yourselves. And while you're busy so thinking about other people's suffering, you can't think about your own suffering. So it makes you, so completely changes the whole dynamic of the whole situation. It completely changes your whole psychology in this very deep and profound way. Plus, it is so merit-giving. It is so merit-giving. It generates such huge positive karma to think in this way, that karma starts ripening. And, and for me, even though, and potentially this was this horrendous experience, I never look back on this experience of this hospital stay as a nightmare or even particularly terrible. It really, I still had, this intense pain and so forth, but it just completely changed my whole psychology. So anyway, it was said actually in the early days, the people who first developed this Tonglen, they were using it to help people, lepers in a leper colony. And this one monk was teaching these lepers in a leper colony. And this teaching was so powerful and was generating such positive karma that he was noticing that some of his lepers were actually being cured of leprosy. And for many years, it was passed as a secret teaching because people thought it was such a powerful teaching that, they were a little bit worried about it. And eventually they let it out, but it's practiced by many Mahayana Buddhists. It's a very, very powerful teaching. So anyway, I don't have time to talk about it any more than that. But anyway, it's just useful to know about this. And if you get an opportunity to get more, and there's more to it, there's other things that are also involved in training the mind that are also extremely, extremely beneficial ways of thinking that can, it is the best way, this training the mind, in my mind, is the best way of dealing with the difficulties of life. So if you want to make yourself happy, no matter what happens to you, these practices are really amazing. So that's from my own personal experience. Okay, so any question? Okay, thank you, TH. Okay, so now I will go on to talk about the wisdom of emptiness, which I think is the most powerful, well, it is the most powerful, deepest part of Buddhism. And this wisdom of emptiness is actually what liberates you and what purifies your negative karma, ripping out all of your negative karma from the root so it can never arise again. This is the most purifying teaching in all of Buddhism. And it's given different names. And and we can sort of achieve, but it is possible to get a sense of what it's about. It's a way, in some sense, it's a way of looking at the world the way the world really is. So seeing the world the way it really is. And why don't we normally see the world the way it is? You think, well, I look at the world, I see the desk, the computer, of course I see the world the way it is. And the reason we don't see the way the world in an accurate way is actually because of this egotism inside ourselves. Usually, all of our way of looking at the world is usually distorted by this sort of egotism. We always look through the world with this lens of our egotism. What's good for me? What's bad for me? What do I like? What do I hate? And this distorts our way of looking at the world. And as I said before, these things are delusions. And ignorance is the root of all delusions. All of these things like anger, jealousy, grasping, greed, all of these things are delusions, distorted ways of looking at the world. And as I talked about in an earlier class, these distortions are because of we exaggerate things in our environment. So if we really like something, we exaggerate all of the good qualities of the thing. And if we hate something, we exaggerate all of the bad qualities. You know, it's the thing that people that fall in love, you know, they exaggerate how wonderful the beloved is when they're in the state of love, you know, and sometimes we talk about, you know, we realize that these are sort of almost infatuations. And where the infatuation part comes from is this exaggeration. In the same way, sometimes people develop these crazy hatreds towards certain people. But how do they develop these crazy hatreds? It's not accidental. It's because all they do is think over and over again about how bad and terrible these people are. And they exaggerate all of their bad qualities. And they can't imagine that their enemies or people they hate could have any good qualities whatsoever. So exaggeration is sort of our technique for distorting the world. And so this notion of emptiness is something that tears away at the root of all of these other delusions. And so it's a very deep thing. And so I'm going to come back and explain it a little more carefully what it means. But before I do, I think it's useful just to see the higher stage of the Buddhist path and how this meditations on it's really deep meditations at emptiness that take you the final stage through liberation and full enlightenment. And on the Mahayana path, the way it works typically is, first of all, you have to develop a very deep meditation called calm abiding or shamatha. And this very deep meditation is extraordinarily deep. I mean, this is the sort of thing where you can sit down to meditate and literally meditate for days on end with single pointed concentration, where your mind never strays from the object of your concentration. That's how powerful this is. And there are, again, it's like everything in Buddhism, there are techniques that you use to develop this. You know, in the beginning stage, you just learn how to develop meditation and so forth. But there are specific techniques to lead you to this type of thing. But it requires an intense amount of effort because it's a very powerful mind. And if you have such a powerful mind, it makes your mind laser point. And so it makes your mind penetrative. Your mind your mind is so focused at such, you know, it's like taking a magnifying glass where you take the rays of the sun and you focus down to a small point. You can actually start fires with that sort of thing. That's the same idea as your mind, when it has this ability to focus at a single point and just be able to be held there, develops these amazing abilities to penetrate and understand any subject. And so first of all, you usually develop this calm abiding. And when you do this, actually, there's a transformation. You develop this amazing suppleness in your body. It's like you come closer and closer to this concentration. Then at some point, it's almost continuous, but at some point, it's like you cross a threshold and your body develops this amazing flexibility. And you can sit for days, months on end with no problem with your body. Your body feels as light as a feather. And then, and you usually need this calm abiding to develop this spontaneous bodhicitta. So then you try to develop this spontaneous bodhicitta. And with this powerful mind, it makes it easier to actually develop, so you meditate with these and develop your bodhicitta. So you develop your bodhicitta and you start on the 5 final paths, the 5 really high level paths. So the paths that you do, the first path is called the Path of Accumulation. And you go on the path of accumulation once you develop spontaneous bodhicitta. It's called the Path of Accumulation because when you have this spontaneous bodhicitta, you start generating positive karma and merit like crazy. So you're accumulating the huge amount of merit you need to reach the higher level paths. And then what you start doing is you start meditating on emptiness using the shamatha. And when you do these meditations on emptiness, again, you penetrate the notion of emptiness deeper and at a deeper and deeper level. And then again, you cross in sort of a continuous way some threshold, and you develop the what's called special insight. And this special insight gives you an even more flexible body and mind. And when you hit this special insight, then you simultaneously have both calm abiding and special insight. And so people talk about the union of calm abiding and special insight. So you have combined in the same mind this deep meditation, which is the calm abiding, and this deep wisdom, which is special insight. And that's when you pass into the second stage, called the path of preparation. And it's preparing you for a direct realization of emptiness, which we're coming to. So then you keep going deeper and deeper. So now you're meditating on emptiness with these two powerful minds conjoined in union. And you go deeper and deeper. And then finally, at a certain point, and again, you approach it gradually and sort of pass almost continuously into it. But again, there's a sharp demarcation. At a certain point, you have a direct realization of emptiness. And this direct realization is said to be what they call a yogic direct realization. And it's a special spiritual way of seeing. So it's said that with the way people talk about it, in the same way with our eyes, we can see the table in front of us. With our spiritual eyes, we can directly see the truth of emptiness. We directly see it. There's no doubt in our mind whatsoever. It's like it's as clear as a bell to us. And that's called a direct realization of emptiness. And once we achieve that direct realization of emptiness, that pushes us on to the path of seeing. And at that point, we become a special being. We're called an Arya, which is Sanskrit for noble being. So Aryas are people who have achieved these direct realizations of emptiness. And when you achieve this direct realization of emptiness, then you have this amazing mind. And once you have this, then you keep, with this mind, you keep meditating on emptiness. And as you meditate on emptiness, you keep purifying your mind more and more, deeper and deeper levels. So at the beginning stages, you purify what they call acquired ignorance. So where you've had teachings of the wrong stuff, you purify that, you're able to penetrate that, see through that. When you've wiped out all of those cases of acquired ignorance, and literally pulled them out by the root, you see them so clearly that they can never arise again. At that point, you pass into the final path, which is the fourth path, called the path of meditation. And on this path of meditation, you keep purifying deeper levels of your negativity. And these are called your innate levels of negativity. These are levels of negativity that spontaneously arise in you due to the habits of countless infinite lifetimes of previous. And again, you pull out, so you pull out the roots of anger, you pull out the roots of jealousy, you pull out each of these negative aspects one by one in such a way that they can never occur again. They are permanently eradicated until you pull out all of the negativities. And when that happens, then you achieve a state of nirvana. You are liberated from samsara. But at that point, since your goal is not only liberation from samsara, but this higher state of full Buddhahood, you remain in samsara. You develop the wish to be reborn in samsara, so you can keep meditating on these. So you keep being reborn in samsara, not out of necessity, the way most of us are, but out of choice. But again, you have this amazingly purified mind. So you keep meditating on emptiness. And now they say that there's these really things which are slight negativities, which are not really negativities at all. They liken it to sort of, as an analogy, putting some garlic in a closed box, leaving it sit for a year or two, then opening the box, you remove the garlic, which is like removing your real negativities, and there's this whiff of the smell of garlic that's left over. It's that those sort of imprints of negativities that you're removing. They're not real. I think for us, we don't really understand what this means, but there are some negativities, or they're not real negativities, but sort of hints of them that you remove. And those are the things you have to purify to go all the way to Buddhahood. And when you've removed the last of those through these deep meditations on emptiness, they call it equipoise, is the technical term for these meditations where you're directly realizing emptiness and meditating on emptiness with this direct realization. When finally you've purified the last of these imprints, then you transition to full Buddhahood, which is the fifth path. And it's called the path of no more learning, because there's nothing more to learn. You're a Buddha. So that's how the higher stages works. And again, it's a very schematic thing. And for us in the lower paths, it's maybe we don't really completely understand it. But that is the final path for how you go through the last end stages all the way to Buddhahood. So let me stop here and ask if there's any questions, because then I'm going to come back and talk about what emptiness is, or the little I can say in 10 minutes or so, because I don't have much time. I've got 15 minutes. Are there any questions on this? Or again, these other paths are actually, Kathleen, you have a question?
I do.
Okay.
What was number 3?
Okay, so I'll go through. So the first was Path of Accumulation. The second was the Path of Preparation. And the third is called the Path of Seeing. So the third one is that, so the Path of Seeing is when you have a direct realization. And then the fourth is the Path of Meditation. And then the fifth is the Path of no more learning, or complete Buddhahood. Okay, is that okay? And I think actually Don Hendrick, one of our teachers, is giving a course on these paths and grounds right now, and sort of at the same time on, I think, Wednesday nights. But anyway, these are things that are taught, and there's a lot more to say about it. So I can just sort of give you the bare bones, but I think it's useful to just know that there is this path that you follow, this procedure, and it's not random. There is specific things that you need to accomplish to become a Buddha. And if you can accomplish these things, you will become a Buddha. Okay, so now let's go back, sidestep. What is emptiness? So I said emptiness is knowing the way the world really is. And the key, there's a lot of terminology that's used about this. In our tradition, the most important terminology is, they say, lack of inherent existence, which is said to be not existing from its own side or by way of its own nature. And so what does this mean, roughly? What this means is that objects in our world are not sort of independently existing objects all on their own. So the way we normally think is we normally think we have this external world out there, and we got these objects, and these are real objects, and these objects just exist all by themselves. You got these, the table is just there, it's just existing. And it's not existing because of my mind or because of anything else. It's just, once it's existing, it's just naturally existing. And what the Buddha talked about, and in fact, even the historical Buddha, the way he talked about it was a notion called dependent origination, was the technical terminology for it. And basically, what the Buddha said is that the way our world is all driven by causes and conditions. That there is that if there is something like a table in front of us, there are causes and conditions that cause that table to exist in that way in front of us. And there are causes and conditions. So if this table keeps persisting in this way, the reason why it's not continuing to persist in this way under its own power, so to speak, is because there are causes and conditions that support it continuing to exist in this way. And so one way of understanding that this table does not exist under its own power is think about changing Because, you know, to us, it looks like the table is just inert. It's just sitting there. It's just existing happily on its own. Well, if I were to take the temperature in my room and raise it to 1,000 degrees centigrade, what would happen? Well, this temperature would spontaneously burst into flame. The only reason why this table continues to exist the way it is because I maintain the temperature at room temperature. And you can look at that. And in fact, if I brought a lot of humidity into this room, this wood would start absorbing moisture and would start to rot away. So the reason why so it looks to us like, and you can even take even harder things like a metal. You know, take a little metal, seems so solid, so substantial, so existing on its own. But, you know, if you take that piece of metal and throw it into the kind of furnace that you get in a steel mill, it would immediately melt and all of its properties would be completely different. And it's like that with everything. Everything doesn't exist under its own power. There are causes or conditions that are, you know, everything that's happening to us is done through causes and conditions. And so that is what is involved with emptiness. And that's the way the world really is. And if you think about it, you know, that's what our science teaches us, that everything comes from causes and conditions. And in Buddhism, we extend that even into our mental world. Everything has causes and conditions. And in fact, one thing that's very helpful for thinking about emptiness, and in one of the Buddhist sutras in the Pali Canon, which he actually talked about, so one of his teachings that he gave when he was alive, he actually said it was actually very helpful to think about impermanence. Because impermanence is not the same as emptiness, but if you think about impermanence, it really leads you in the right direction toward emptiness. Because if you think that everything is impermanent, everything changes, then that is the opposite of anything being able to support itself, if you like, to be independent. Nothing in this world is independent. Everything in our world is interrelated, depends on other aspects of the world. There's no way we can separate absolutely anything out of our world and sort of pull it out and separate it from any outside influence. Everything in our world is absolutely connected. And because it is absolutely connected, that realization is the realization of emptiness. Is the realization that everything comes about through causes and conditions and will continually change and does not exist under its own power. And you ask, well, why does this matter so much? You know, why is this going to remove all of our negativities? Why is it going to do all these amazing things? You know, and again, this thought that I've just given you isn't enough to do it. So my thinking this isn't removing all of my, you know, negativities from my mind. And the reason it's not is because in order to be powerful, it has to be done under these states of calm abiding and special insight. You need these special, you have to realize this at a really deep level. I mean, this has to be really ingrained in you that this is the way the world really is. Because it's only when you have that it has this powerful effect. And so again, you say, okay, well, that's great, but even why is it so important that you realize this at this deep ingrained level where it's as clear as a bell to you, you know, and that's why you need this direct realization of emptiness. It has to be, you know, there's no doubt in your mind. It's just so obvious that this is the way it is. So why is that so important? Well, I think the way to look at that is because it removes all of these distortions. Because when you look at our sort of egotistical point of view, our egotistical point of view is almost always built on things being permanent. You know, if I get $1 billion, I'm going to be permanently happy. You know, if I have a completely healthy life, then I am permanently happy. We always think that if we get a certain things, it makes us permanently happy. And because of that, that's why we murder people. That's why people steal. You know, that's why, you know, people sexually molest people. They always think if I can get this pleasure, then I'm permanently happy. We always have this sense of permanence because, you know, if I get $1 billion, but it could disappear the next day, you know, it's here, neither here nor there, you know, it comes and goes. that's not satisfactory for us. Everything that's satisfactory for us has to have this feeling of permanence about it. And that's why we exaggerate things. That's where this exaggeration comes in. If I have this, then we feel like, oh, I'll be happy for the rest of my life. And it's not true. There's nothing you can achieve that will make you happy for the rest of your life. The rest of your life is going to be continual change. You'll have high moments, lower moments, but it's going to flip up and down throughout your whole life. And in fact, all of your samsaric life is like that. It goes up and down. And in samsara, there's no permanent happiness. There's no permanent heaven. There are heavenly-like states of existence, but even those are impermanent in Buddhism. You, through great amounts of positive karma, you can achieve sort of heavenly realms. But then when you burn up all of that positive karma, then you fall back down into lower realms. So everywhere in samsara, nothing in samsara can be satisfactory because there can be no permanent happiness. And that's what this notion of emptiness attacks. It really demonstrates to you that in samsara, it's never going to be good. There's always going to be problems. There's always going to be, you just can't maintain these peak levels of happiness. It will just never happen. And so that is what enables you to purify all of your negative tendencies. And when you really see that in this really deep way, when you really, really get it at such a deep level, it's like, there's no point to doing anything negative. It really uproots it at this very deep level. But again, the understanding has to be done at a very deep level for it to have this effect. And that's why it needs to be done within these deep meditations. So that's probably about as much as I can say to explain emptiness, because, it's like emptiness is as vast teachings. People give, 6-month, year-long courses in emptiness. So there's a lot more to it. So I can just give you a little bit of a flavor of it. But anyway, I hope that, so let me just ask if there's any questions. Okay, it's that's considered the most difficult thing to understand. But anyway, I just tried to give you a little bit of flavor of it. So let's go into Vajrayana and Tantric practice, the final thing. I've got 5 minutes. I don't like to run over because I know some of you are in different time zones. So what is all that about? So that is actually part of the Mahayana Path. So the Tantric or Vajrayana path is called the quick path to enlightenment. So it's a set of special techniques, but they are Mahayana techniques. And so in a way, this is a way of accelerating this path to enlightenment. And to practice this path, it needs a special spiritual ceremony called an empowerment, which supposedly implants a special imprint on your mental continuum that will make this kind of practice effective. So you can read books on how to practice Tantra or Vajrayana practice, but it's said that even if you do the practices, that if you don't have the empowerment, it just won't work. You won't get the results that you were expecting. So it is this Tantra Vajrayana path is also said to require strong faith in Buddhism because it's really quite esoteric stuff. When you hear about it, it sounds absolutely crazy. And so you got to have some confidence that it's really going to work. Otherwise, you're never going to practice it. But it is amazingly powerful. If you start practicing these things, the levels of meditation and mind you can get to are just astonishing. But it can also be a little bit dangerous because you really penetrate really powerful states of mind. So it's usually considered that if you really go intensely into this, this is something that you should practice under a living spiritual guide, a guru, who can help you through any rough spots that may arise. And rough spots can arise. I mean, some of these practices, if they're overdone, they can lead to certain states of even physical distress where people have trouble breathing and stuff. So it's best never to really practice them to go overboard with your practice. But nonetheless, it is considered the quick path to enlightenment. And the way you usually do it is you usually go somewhere to take an empowerment. And there are empowerments that are given all over the place. And for the Tibetans, they used to only give it to their special disciples, but now even ordinary people can get these empowerments. And then there are basically, there's actually I think there's 4 different levels of Tantra, and there are some lower levels called action Tantras, of which it's very common to give empowerments. And these are things like, they're associated with Tara, Manjushri empowerments, things like that. So are often sort of action tantras. And there's various levels, but the deepest level is called highest yoga tantra. And those are usually associated with some special tantric deity, often called a yidam. So there are people like Vajrayana and Haruka, things like that, or these various, there's more than that, there's a variety of different highest yoga tantras. But on all of them, there are 2 levels of tantra. There's, they call them stages, generation stage and completion stage. And on the generation stage, it's a stage of, again, I talked about imagination being very powerful. The generation stage involves deep levels of imagination, where you do deep meditations, imagining yourself to be the tantric deity or yidam. And the reason why this is so powerful is that if you can actually develop this insight so deeply, then if you can start acting like that tantric Buddha, where you have all the qualities of a Buddha, perfect compassion, love, so forth, then what's the difference between you or a Buddha? If you can act exactly like a Buddha would act, what's the difference? And so you start generating amazing amounts of positive karma, because you start generating similar types of minds to what a real Buddha would generate. Of course, you can't really do that, but you know, in similitude. So similitude is actually important. And so in this generation stage, it involves huge amounts of this sort of imaginative practice. And that's what generation stage is about. Of course, there's huge amounts more to it. It's also said that you can only practice Tantra if you do have a Bodhichitta motivation. So you only practice Vajrayana or a Tantric practice in order to accelerate your Buddhahood more quickly, so that you can more quickly help other sentient beings. And then the other stage is even wilder, and it's called completion stage. And this completion stage involves very deep notions of our subtle mind and bodies. And these are things where you start talking about chakras, channels, winds, things like that. And these are said to really exist at a very deep level, but they're sort of spiritual qualities. So your channels, winds, and chakras and so forth aren't, you can't, a surgeon can't cut you open and find these things, but these are very subtle spiritual aspects to our minds and bodies. And so this is a thing where, again, you need this sort of deep faith that this stuff is really real and will work. And of course, as you practice it and you discover in your own personal experience the power of these practices, which are amazingly deep, blissful meditations, Again, one of the people that started our tradition, Lama Yeshe, who is now dead, but when he was alive, he used to say, well, if people knew about these meditations, they forget about sex, everything else. That's all they would want to do is day and night do these meditations, because these things have so much more bliss than anything else you could imagine on earth. But anyway, these are very powerful meditations. And a lot of it, again, is done initially through imagination. And again, what happens in all of these things is you start with imagination, and in a sense, the imagination becomes more and more real the deeper you penetrate into these meditations. And so that's probably about, and in the end, you get what's known as a union of great bliss and emptiness. Again, the only way you can develop these things is with a notion of emptiness, where you realize that nothing is essentially what it is, but anything can change into anything else. And in particular, you can change into a Buddha. So it does require these sort of notions of emptiness to be successful also. And there's a little bit of an understanding of emptiness to really get into this, of why it's even possible. But at any rate, it's in the end, it's called the union of great bliss and emptiness, which are these sort of deepest completion stage meditations, which are just amazing, take you deep places. And the power of this method is, in Buddhism, there's 3 levels of mind: a gross, subtle, and very subtle. The very subtle mind, usually for ordinary people, only occurs at the moment of death. But the power of the very subtle mind is it has no it's delusion free. It's an absolutely pure level of mind. And that pure level of mind, because it has no distractions or delusions, is the most powerful mind you can develop. And if you can gain control over your death process and what's happening to your mind at the moment of death, this mind will emerge, and you can use it to meditate on emptiness and achieve full enlightenment at the moment of death. And that's sort of the idea. And some of these completion-like stages, you can access this very subtle mind. And it's because you can start to access this very powerful, subtle mind, you can achieve these deep meditations, which can enable you to accelerate your direct realizations of emptiness and purify your mind and so forth. So it has all of these ideas are sort of combined. So the details are very complex. And some of it, quite frankly, it's hard to understand because it sort of goes beyond our sort of normal sphere of experience. But again, if you start experiencing things, these are very, very amazing, powerful states. So that's probably all that I can useful say about Tantra. In the 5 minutes, I've run over, I'm 4 minutes over. So I should probably stop here. Let me ask if there's any questions. Okay, yeah, thank you, thank you.
Bob, I have a question.
Yes.
I'm sorry. You mentioned that you need a Bodhichitta motivation to do the Tantra.
Yes.
Do you need to have have developed?
Oh, no, you don't need spontaneous bodhicitta.
You can get by with the fake bodhicitta.
Yeah, aspiring bodhicitta is good enough. but essentially, when you're doing this tantric practice, you try to keep in the back of your mind that you're not doing it just because you want to bliss out, but because you really want to achieve Buddhahood in order to help other sentient beings. So just having that thought in your mind, just that kind of motivation is sufficient. Because almost none of us who are practicing Tantric or Vajrayana has spontaneous bodhicitta. I mean, spontaneous bodhicitta is this amazing high level achievement. And, so the vast majority of people that are practicing Tantra or Vajra, or this Tantric practice, Vajrayana practice, really don't have spontaneous bodhicitta. But essentially, practicing Tantra or Vajrayana can accelerate your progress toward developing bodhicitta, because it generates it generates huge amount of positive karma. So this tantric practice is very deep, generates huge amounts of positive karma, and it accelerates your whole Mahayana practice at all levels. And so it's very powerful. But no, your prerequisite in terms of Mahayana is just an ordinary, in your mind thinking, oh, it'd be great if I could accelerate my Buddhahood so I can help all sentient beings. That's all you need. So I wouldn't worry about that. No, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you.
Okay. So any other questions? Okay. Well, that's the end of the. Okay, Kim.
I have a question, Bob.
Okay.
I was wondering, are you going to be teaching other courses at Norbu Ling?
Well, no, at this point, this is the only course I teach. We have other teachers.
Okay.
In our tradition, you have to have all of these prerequisites. You have to take these courses. You have to go through this whole thing. And I've never been willing to go through all the stuff it does to become qualified to teach these other things. But they do let me teach this one, so I teach this course. I used to teach the beginning meditation course, but since we're teaching so much now and alternating, my friend Stephen teaches that. But I used to teach that introduction to meditation course also. But no, this is all I'm allowed to do. But it's okay.
Well,
I'm happy to do what I can.
thank you. It's
Okay.
really been helpful for me. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad. Yeah, thank you all for attending. It's it's my wish to help all of you in whatever way I can. I've tried to be as clear as I can, but a lot of the stuff is very deep and difficult, and it's a process of, you just have to keep going over it over and over and again, and gradually you slowly get it. So anyway, thank you so much for all of you for attending.